Final Fantasy XIV. Ignore the hype from the disgruntled WoW players. I sure did. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Tuesday, March 26th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
So Tokyo Fanfest is now in the history books, and we are now technically in the run-up to the Shadowbringers launch for Final Fantasy XIV this coming summer. And quite frankly, I'm rather underwhelmed. Maybe this is residual influence from the way that Blizzard used to do things with BlizzCon. They would announce new features during the opening keynote, and then go into detail on these new features at the breakout sessions. But Square Enix didn't do that. There were some new announcements like the dancer class and whatnot during the keynote at Tokyo FanFest, but then the so-called development panel about how Final Fantasy XIV gets made just had a bunch of art people, and they showed how a town went together, and that was all right, I guess. But what I was really looking for was some more detail on how the trust system was going to work and potential expansion plans. Because there is an ongoing people problem in Final Fantasy XIV, and apparently that's affecting the demographics over in Japan, where there's people that want to play the game like a JRPG and just do the story content and not really do too much, if anything at all, with the MMO stuff. So that way their ability to progress through the story isn't held back by bad or toxic players. And that's perfectly understandable. As a JRPG, Final Fantasy XIV does quite well with its story content. In terms of being like the good book that you just can't put down, one more page, one more chapter, one more page, one more chapter, and that kind of stuff, as well as becoming attached to the characters and stuff. Basically, the stuff that caused the Eris controversy in Final Fantasy VII, where people were upset that a big character in the story got killed off at a certain point during the game, and they're like, there's gotta be a way to revive Eris. It's been a meme for over 20 years now, so I hope that's not too much of a spoiler for Final Fantasy VII. But people were upset by that, and I was upset there too, because I liked how she was as a healer in the party and things along those lines. But fast forward to today, and the stuff people are saying about Final Fantasy XIV. I absolutely cannot bring myself to agree with all the accolades that this game is receiving. And there's a couple of things that I think are in play with Final Fantasy XIV. But when you look at the whole package, and not just the strong story content, which is intrinsic to a lot of JRPGs out there, Final Fantasy XIV does not deserve the accolades that it has been receiving. Let's get into some of the reasons why I think this. For one thing, there's something in play here that I call the satellite TV fallacy. If you think about Rabbit Ears TV, Antenna TV, progressing to cable TV in the 1980s and whatnot, and then you think about cable doing its thing and then satellite TV becoming a thing, satellite really seems like a step backwards because it introduces things like reception issues and weather outages and other stuff that hadn't been dealt with since the Rabbit Ears TV era, where the picture would go out and you'd wiggle the antenna to try and get it to come back or something along those lines. But the thing with satellite is that sometimes they can compete on price and some other things, and folks who don't like the cable company will go with satellite if they want pay TV. And this is where the fallacy comes into play. Something is not automatically good just because something else is bad. It needs to be good on its own merit. And there's something like this going on right now between Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth. There are disgruntled WoW players who are coming over to Final Fantasy XIV and then turning around and making YouTube videos about, oh, this game's awesome, da-da-da-da. When in reality, if you break down their arguments, it's just raw emotion and maybe some vengeance because of their disgruntled attitudes towards World of Warcraft. But the bottom line is, Final Fantasy XIV is not automatically good just because World of Warcraft is bad right now. And these players coming over that are bringing these attitudes with them aren't exactly being warmly received either. If you come into a dungeon group in this game and you cause drama in the blue chat or in the party chat, it's not surprising to me if one of the other players turns around and says, you must have come over from World of Warcraft. It's cool that WoW's reputation for drama and being a kiddie game has come over to Final Fantasy, but unfortunately Final Fantasy is totally pot meat kettle with this sort of thing. If you thought Night Elves and Blood Elves were bad in WoW, Well, going over to Final Fantasy means you go from Western RPG to JRPG. So the usual JRPG trimmings of pretty little anime-inspired JRPG characters, teenagers saving the world, blah, blah, blah. And whereas in WoW you have Night Elves and Blood Elves, and of course now the allied races have compounded this a little more in BFA, you come over to Final Fantasy and you have Lalafells, you've got the Midlanders who are basically teenagers, you have the cat people, and next expansion with the release of the Viera, there's gonna be bunny ladies. Woo! It's the old, please don't put pretty people in the horde thing all over again for the old-timer WoW players out there who were upset when Blood Elves were added because they thought that all the kids that wanted pretty RPG characters were going to come over to the horde and bring drama with them and stuff like that, because previously it was orcs, tauren, trolls, and undead, all ugly characters. Well, Final Fantasy has that in large amounts. And the behavior, of course, is more widespread. And despite the behavior being more widespread, though, and the higher risk of running into toxic people when you're forced to group with people to advance through the story through dungeons and trials, as I've been writing in blog entries going all the way back to 2013, this game is the worst of the MMOs when it comes to dealing with toxic players, because the blacklisting system is very clunky. Here's how the blacklist system should work. I decide I don't want to play this game with somebody. I don't want to see what they're saying in chat. I don't want to be grouped up with them in the duty finder. Right-click, block. The end. Even if it's in a dungeon. If somebody's acting up and I decide I want to shut them up for the rest of this run and then never see them again, right-click, block. Game over. But that's not the way it works. You have to macro, you have to know a / command blist add, you have to use quotes, and I've never been able to successfully get it to work with a cross-server person unless they actually harassed me in the chat, and I could right-click them after I got out of the dungeon. And there are players who are figuring this out, and so they will just spam angry emotes at you instead of actually saying something, because they know it's a lot harder for you to take action if they don't say anything. The latest person to cause these problems held back my progression through the end of the Alamigo storyline in Stormblood. But here's the interesting part about Final Fantasy XIV. Every player is on the lodestone, and if you don't log into the lodestone on the web, your blacklist is not reflected. So even if you blacklist somebody, you can then turn around and cross-reference your blacklist to the lodestone to see what's the rest of the story on this person. The last person who gave me trouble, oh, what do you know? Anime-inspired cat lady, plays nothing but DPS, never tanks, stopped healing about halfway to a third to halfway through the game, doesn't craft, doesn't gather, doesn't have any player titles, and doesn't have a free company. And this person was the latest self-destructing samurai who animated their way into getting blown up by every AE attack in the dungeon, and then turned around and gave me angry emotes when I decided to stop healing them and rezzing them as a healer, because it was just a waste over and over again, because they wouldn't let the tank be the one standing in the cleaves. Again, the way this should work is right-click, block. If they don't say anything, you should be able to do it with emotes. If they don't use any emotes, you should be able to just go into the combat log, find one of their attacks, right-click, block. Simple and very much in line with my philosophy towards players who don't want to work as a team in an MMO. When you get into the higher-end content like raids, that's all about teamwork. So if you can't handle a 5-man leveling dungeon because you don't want to play correctly and you want to disrespect everyone else's time, why should anybody be forced to carry you through the content? But not only is the blacklist system clunky, something that I was complaining about in my blog in 2013, so no progress there. Actually, a little bit easier. You can right-click report, right-click block in some cases, but we're still not there yet. Why does it have to be such a project to get something this basic for letting players take command of their experiences and choose to run the risk of higher queue times instead of having to put up with bad people like this? Why does this have to be such a project? Why is it not that I just right-click block in the dungeon? If I don't want anything to do with these people, I want to shut them up and never see them again, boom, done. Why does it have to be like this? Why does it have to be pokey? Why do I have to use a slash command? Why do I have to get the syntax right like I'm typing on a DOS prompt or something like that? Why does this have to be so difficult when it can just be right-click block? And why does the blacklist go away if you do a server transfer? Again, right-click block. Now here we are at the 10-minute mark in this discussion, and we've talked about a grand total of 1 issue with the game. But there's more. Oh, is there more? Let's expand things out a bit besides problem players. So, Yoshi P and the development team, they openly admit that they keep an eye on Blizzard, and they try and see if there's any ideas they can adopt for Final Fantasy over in World of Warcraft. Now, this may get people thinking, ha ha ha, well, clone. But when you think about Blizzard talking around in circles, if anybody brings up a good idea in another game, the willingness to acknowledge that other games can have good ideas is actually a good thing for Final Fantasy XIV. Sometimes it goes a little overboard, though. If you liked Wrath of the Lich King and the messy way that the early heroics were in that game, then you will love Final Fantasy XIV, because Final Fantasy XIV inherited what Blizzard later tried to move away from in Cataclysm. Seriously, go into a dungeon group and you're going to see the same things over and over again. You're going to run into a tank who tries to pull 2 rooms, constantly risks dying, and hopefully the healer can keep up, but they're still going to get stuck spamming because the tank is routinely going to pull too much. Now, because Square Enix decided they didn't want to follow in Blizzard's footsteps on this, there are very tough AE caps on all AoE abilities so that the damage isn't so that you just pull whole rooms and blow them all up. So we don't entirely have a Lich King environment here. So unlike in the heydays of Lich King, the way this usually works is the tank runs away like a maniac, grabs a ton of enemies, and then you stand there chipping away at them for like 4 or 5 minutes instead of just dealing with them one group at a time. This is the part where somebody's like, oh my goodness, that makes the run faster. Does it? So you take the healer out of the fight in a game where healers in high-end content are expected to contribute to the DPS, and their abilities don't do insignificant damage either. So healers can do damage. The catch is they have to stop healing in order to do so. And this is one of the reasons why, for tanking in this game, mitigation equals DPS. Because if you don't need to be healed, your healer, if they know what they're doing, becomes your cannon as a tank. Now, having leveled to 71st as a scholar, the healer with a little bit of nuance in this game, there's a rather not very much talked about feature, except among strategist types like myself, where after level 60, the off-global cooldown side of being a scholar is heavily emphasized. So if your tank's not taking too much damage, you can blow things up with Broil and Broil 2, and then heal the tank with an off cooldown while the spells are recharging. So you can basically do the healer version of, if you remember, seal twisting with paladins in World of Warcraft. Those of you that have been playing MMOs for any respectable length of time, that's basically what gets put on the table. But no. Let's pull 2 whole rooms and stick the healer spamming physic all the time, because the tank just pops all their cooldowns and then at once, which you're not really supposed to do according to most strategies that I've been reading lately. And just hope that they can spam physic or cure 2 or whatever and keep you up before they run out of MP. Real engaging gameplay, right? As opposed to blow up what's in front of you, but don't stop. Go to the first group, DPS blows them up, and because there's less of them, they can use stronger attacks to blow them up. The healer can get in on the fight because the tank's taking less damage, so they can blow them up too. Move on to the next one, blow them up. Rinse, lather, repeat. All the way to the boss, get the loot, be on your way. But no, we have to settle for dungeon runs that are a messed up version of Lich King, even though Square Enix has taken liberties to try and keep that from being a viable way of playing, and things flip the other way in the higher end content like the raids, where the tanks have to be careful what they pull, and in some cases not even be in their tank stance. And the healers have to contribute to the damage so that you don't hit the enrage timer on a boss fight. So you spend your entire leveling experience playing one way, and then you go into raids and you're expected to completely flip in the other direction overnight. And then raiders wonder why there's people that can't figure out the mechanics. Because they've spent all of the game up to the beginning of their raiding days doing one thing, and now they're expected to do something else. And these Final Fantasy players think this is good. Oh yeah, let's stand there spamming AoE for 5 minutes because we just grabbed 2 rooms at once and stressed everybody out instead of just blowing up what was in front of us with the DPS. But if you decide to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem and you go in as a tank and you try to do that, you'll get people whining at you, "You're not fast enough, pull more. Or you'll have DPS take matters into their own hands and pull the boss towards you, and if you don't if you don't peel what they pull off of them and then try to cool down and pray and whittle them all down at once, oh my goodness, fail tank! And the DPS wonder why DPS queues are so long. Oh, yes, by the way, another thing that this game inherited from Wrath of the Lich King, queue times, and all of the unintended consequences that longer DPS queues bring, including DPS people playing as tanks just for a shorter queue. But you can always tell who those people are, especially if you're playing heals. And then there's healers that do the same thing. They want to break from the long queues, so they play a role they're not interested in and never get any good at, and they hold back groups that way. This is how I know that Gunbreaker is not going to fix the tank shortage in this game. Matter of fact, just like Death Knights and Wrath of the Lich King, it's going to make it worse. Because if you get a free level 60 with a two-handed weapon, guess who that's going to appeal to? Just like all those DPS that play warriors. Yeah, so you're going to have somebody in 60-plus dungeons leveling who started at 60 may have never played a tank before they started their free 60. It's like a boost buyer, except it's free. Oh, dungeons are going to be so annoying in the 60 to 70 range when Shadowbringers drops. Just you watch. Same thing happened with Death Knights and Wrath of the Lich King, and it's going to happen here as well. Remember, the FF14 devs have mentioned that they do keep an eye on Blizzard and see if there's any good ideas they can adopt over in WoW. It's one of the reasons why the A Realm Reborn did better than 1.0, because 1.0 was too fishbowled in terms of its mentality, being based too much on the prior success of Final Fantasy XI. And yet, the times that this game does borrow some ideas from World of Warcraft have had mixed results, and the net result is, out of the MMOs that I play right now, this is the most solidly second-generation MMO of the entire bunch. Compared to ESO, compared to Guild Wars 2, heck, I'm even tempted to try Neverwinter again to see if that game has improved and pulled ahead of this one. And that's the ultimate problem here. What is second-generation MMOs? We should probably go over that again for those of you that have not seen my previous discussions on the matter. Second-generation MMOs consist of World of Warcraft during its heyday and every MMO that wanted to be like World of Warcraft during its heyday. So the ideas that made WoW the success that it was at its peak, and all the other games that wanted to try and copy that. But that also had some consequences to it as well. For example, servers instead of mega shards created situations where abusive people could take advantage of a small server to do their thing and not have to worry about people holding them accountable. Like, for example, syncing raid progression. If you have toxic people playing key roles in raids in a smaller community, there's less people that'll be geared enough and experienced enough to replace them. So you get abusive people who start using their experience as a way to treat others like crap and get away with it. I ran into this with Alex Straza US in my early WoW days. The server had its issues with drama all over the place holding back raid progression. I transferred over to Storm Rage and it was a much better experience until the operations side of it made it a nightmare to stay there because of server queues, which is something that Final Fantasy has too, by the way, second gen MMO. Another defining characteristic of second-generation MMOs is that despite the MMO thing, where there's lots of people playing in this world together, there are often situations where other players are bad news. And these dungeon situations where people don't want to exhibit proper teamwork and get along with their teammates is but one example. I started Final Fantasy XIV in 1.0 in 2010 on the Balmung server before it became the role players' haven that it's known for today. But because it's a very popular server and it's big and whatnot, I figured there'd be operational problems when Shadowbringers launched. So to avoid server queues and all that nonsense, I transferred to another server that is smaller, but it has some of the drama problems, and I'm seeing repeats of my old drama Straza issues with this server. But the thing is, on the operations side of things, with the world visit system that's coming up, Square Enix is making a baby step move from servers towards super shards. So you'll be able to visit other worlds, and there'll be some restrictions here and there, but you'll be able to basically go all around the data center and whatnot. But, I mean, come on now. ESO has had all North American players on one set of infrastructure for how long now? So, baby steps, but it's something that other games are already further along in terms of creating a large environment of players where you can't have like a toxic individual hold up raid progression because there aren't people that can replace them in the raid teams and things along those lines. Moving on to some other things that make me think that Final Fantasy XIV is a little overrated these days and doesn't deserve the accolades that it's been getting from people. The world itself is probably the least immersive in any MMO that I'm playing right now. It's just the scale of the maps and everything. There's also load times and stuff. There's invisible walls. If you're not on a flying mount, you'll be fishing in ankle-deep water in some of the early parts of the game because there was no swimming. That was added later for zones like Costa del Sol and the Ruby Sea in Stormblood. So just the whole thing with the world being compelling in terms of live another life and stuff, it's just not there. And you see some of the immersiveness, what little immersion there is kind of goes away when you start looking at what maps were added in the expansion packs. So you start out in a Realm Reborn, you're wandering around the forests of Gridania, for example, where I started. Now, the Realm Reborn Gridania was a massive improvement over the copy-paste crap that was in 1.0. So, yes, I played 1.0 Gridania, and I don't miss it. But as you progress, the land kind of starts to lose its character, and it starts resembling a map in a video game more than a believable place. When you get to Heavensward, you go to the Kurthus Western Highlands. Oh, look, a war zone where the war with the dragons was fought. You go into Dravania. There's one map, I think it's the Forelands, where you're literally going up and down and up and down again. You're zigzagging around in what is obviously an artificially made path on the way to the mountain where the dragons live and stuff. Sea of Clouds is okay, but what is Sea of Clouds? Just a bunch of small islands in a giant sky. It's pretty. It's great for screenshots or just flying around in your flying mount and relaxing and stuff. Then you get into Stormblood, and you have, what do you have? You have the Ruby Sea. Well, outside of Kugane, when you get over to the Far East, you have the Ruby Sea, which is basically a giant ocean. You can swim underwater, but that takes more effort in this game because you have to hit a key combo in order to dive, unless you're in your flying mount, which then goes underwater and becomes an underwater mount. Yeah. But yeah, so you have a big ocean area, but you can go spearfishing in the water, I think, when you get that unlocked, but there's no enemies in the water and there's no underwater combat. And then you have maps that are mostly water like that. Then you get over to Yangxia, which is where Doma is and whatnot, and it's a section it's like a section around a village. There's this huge wall in the Doma Palace that you can't fly up to thanks to invisible walls. And you can't even fly over the Great Wall. Obviously, the Great Wall thing, a lot of this map is inspired by China, but you can't even fly from one part of the map to the other because of the invisible walls, except around the Doma part of the map. So it's really a giant horseshoe in disguise when you get and you don't find that out until you get your flying mount. But I think the Azim steps are okay, and some of the Alamigo maps are a little bit better in that respect until you unlock flying there too and see the same issues. But the world really starts to lose its character and its immersiveness and feels more like maps and levels in a game than a believable world that people live in. Now you compare on the exact other end of the spectrum, World of Warcraft, and this is one of the biggest ironies of WoW. You only get a load screen when you go from continent to continent or to a different expansion pack or inside a dungeon. You can fly all over the place, go in and out of buildings, no load screen. That was huge when it first came out, in a day and age of load screens all over the place when you change towns, villages, things like that. And that's one of the interesting ironies about how WoW doesn't encourage people to get out in the world enough, and yet they have the best world for people to get out into. But back to Final Fantasy. You'll notice the dated features of this game if you've played ESO or Guild Wars 2. You'll see the situations where other players are a bad thing instead of a good thing, and you'll start to understand why there are people who want to play Final Fantasy XIV as a JRPG and just do the story content and bring NPCs along for the dungeons and Shadowbringers. And that's why I support the trust system. Fault BFA over on the WoW side of things all you want, but I don't have a problem with people being able to gear up without going into dungeons and raids, because it means that socialization is optional. The bigger issue with BFA is things like the war fronts that you can't ever lose, and other little things like that that basically give people free gear that they don't have to work towards. But moving away from forced socialization to optional socialization in these MMOs is really the road forward, because that way you can enjoy the game at your leisure. If you make friends in the game, great! Run dungeons with them. But under no circumstances should people be forced to have their experience ruined, or in the case of the main story in this game, their progression stopped because of bad people in dungeon groups, or bad people elsewhere in the game. The last issue that I can talk about with regards to Final Fantasy XIV being rather dated when you get under the strength of the Final Fantasy brand, or you get under the hood, I should say, of the strength of the Final Fantasy brand and the passion of Yoshi P and the developer team. When you get past all of that, the game is pretty dated, and the MMO Trinity, unfortunately, represents more of this baggage. At this stage of the game, with Stormblood going into Shadowbringers, it's looking more and more like this Final Fantasy theme park, which is basically what this is with all of its references to the other games now, is being held back by generic MMO stuff like the MMO Trinity. Like, for example, you can't add a job to Final Fantasy XIV without tying it to a specific role. And hybrid roles from previous games have to pick one or the other. Red Mage, traditionally, a jack of trades who uses a little bit of white magic, a little bit of black magic, and swings some kind of swashbuckler sword. There's no way to be primarily a swashbuckler and a secondary caster as a red mage, and there's no way to be a healer as a red mage. Red mage is range DPS. You will queue as DPS, no matter what you know how to do with the class. Moving forward to Shadowbringers, people wanted the dancer to be some kind of healer. Dancers in previous games were somewhere between healers, range damage, and support. But because things are so rigid in Final Fantasy XIV, they had to be set as ranged DPS to go along with the bards and machinists. And then there's all the people who want to play DPS warriors and DPS dark knights. I mean, they're big guys in armor with big swords and axes. Why not? But no, they have to be tanks. There's no way for a player to just ride along in the theme park and then just pick how they want to style up their character. And this is one of the big things that I think holds the game back versus something like ESO. ESO is the polar opposite. The so-called character class that you pick is more like a style. You can go in any direction. If you pick a Templar, you're basically saying, I use divine magic. If you play a Warden, you're basically saying, I use nature magic. And then what you do afterwards, light armor, heavy armor, combat, stealth, magic, healing, caster, whatever you want to do, it's up to how you customize your character. With this game, you get shoehorned into a predetermined role for all the jobs, including the ones that sound more like hybrids. There's no way, for example, that I can be a blue mage and heal a group with White Wind. And it's very MP intensive to try to do so, as I found out in one obnoxious run that was unsynced a while back. But don't you see where this bottled up frustration is coming from with some of these players? Never mind the fact, how about all those samurai that want to be tanks because they're living out some kind of anime character thing they have in their head with their characters? Or the dragoons. You know how many self-destructing dragoons I've seen who get blown up trying to pull off their positionals? Same with samurai as well. But behind that keyboard and sometimes very angry player who's got stuck in a DPS queue and now they're upset and blah, 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 is somebody who is frustrated. They want to, they know what they're looking at in front of them, but the game won't let them do that. They can't choose to be a tougher samurai who dodges in order to tank. They can't choose to be a red mage that makes actual use of Vercure in progression content. I mean, and now we're probably going to see the same thing happen with Dancer as well. How many people out there that were hoping that Dancer would be a healer are going to be bummed out if the Dancer has some minor heals on the side as a ranged DPS, but everything has to be shoehorned into something? That's too far in the other direction, and it just frustrates people. But the freedom to move on from this MMO Trinity nonsense is something you see in games like Guild Wars 2 and ESO. Like I said, dated. And that's where we're at with Final Fantasy right now. You can say that it's a good game because you're upset at World of Warcraft, but I would say try something with some newer ideas, like ESO or Guild Wars 2, if you want to see what the world would be like if these second-gen MMO companies stopped half-assing things. Because Square Enix is no stranger to incorporating ideas in a half-assed fashion that other games have figured out a long time ago. Like, for example, level scaling in the outdoor zones. You can still get to the point where there's no point hanging out in any zone anymore because you're way past the level range. Unless you go to the outdoor events, aka fates in this game, and hit the level sync button. And then you can participate in them, and you get down leveled and stuff, and you get popped back up when you finish it up. Some players want you to be able to just hit that button and sync to the level of the zone when you get there, not when you go to an outdoor event. So that way, if you want to have a little bit of challenge in a lower level zone that you want to go back and do some side quests in, there can be something relevant to do there. And that's one of the things that MMOs have moved away from, is instead of content being like this linear path, as you progress in levels, what you can do broadens out. That's the way things have been for the last couple of years. Guild Wars 2 got like that, but people didn't like the automatic downscaling because they thought it eliminated the feeling of progression for their character. Oh, I'm all the way up to level 60, but the level 15 bandits in Queensdale can still kill me if there's too many of them. Yeah, that sort of thing. Another half-assed feature, of course, is going to be the operations. They're moving towards mega shards, so to speak, or one server farm for an entire region, but they're not there yet. They're taking baby steps when there's other games out there that already get this right. How about one last mention of the MMO Trinity for good measure? And a reminder that in higher end content, the Trinity starts to break down. If you're a healer, you're expected to contribute to the DPS in order to not hit the enrage timer. And if you're a tank, you're expected to get the fight down ice cold and then be able to not need your tank stance to contribute to the DPS that way. But we started this discussion with people issues, and we're going to end with a people issue that all of this ties into. Probably the biggest conflict among the player base of Final Fantasy XIV is Final Fantasy versus MMOs. The more generic MMO content like the raids is optional. You can beat the game, finish the story, without having to raid. You'll have to do dungeons, you'll have to do trials, but you won't have to jump into a raid. And the game design decisions have gotten to the point where it is a clash between Final Fantasy Theme Park or MMO. If there's any AAA MMO developer out there that is in the position to try something new and original and leave all of this second-gen, let's copy WoW, MMO stuff in the dust, it's Square Enix. They've got something good here, but are they going to want to ever do something besides play it safe? As it stands, with what happened to Red Mage, Warrior, and Samurai, as well as Dark Knight, I think the Final Fantasy component of this Final Fantasy game is being held back by the generic MMO stuff. And these, among other issues, are why I don't join the chorus of people praising Final Fantasy XIV and can't really imagine myself doing much else after I complete the story content, because there's just more compelling games out there that are using newer ideas to create an experience that moves beyond the problems of the past when it comes to the genre. So I'm very curious as to where trusts go in terms of moving this game forward, and I'm very curious as to where new features in the game go in terms of moving this game forward. It does get some things right. The way it deploys flight, for example, and answers the flight question is better than World of Warcraft's. And there's some other things too related to the retainer system and some of the other things like no hand-holding in the dungeon finder when you group up with parties and stuff like that we've mentioned previously. But ultimately, I think Square Enix is sitting on unrealized potential here. And I don't know if they can solve this either by improving this game or by having it lead into the next Final Fantasy MMO, which they won't have to redo from scratch this time, because if they just develop one and they take the lessons learned so that they're there from the beginning, and you don't have the Band-Aid moments like what you have with the main scenario queue or the main scenario roulette from the end of the original Realm Reborn, I think this game has potential, but I'm not convinced that Square Enix wants to do anything other than play it safe. And playing it safe is going to have them end up with a Final Fantasy theme park MMO that's dated and never really lives up to its potential. Thanks for listening, everybody. This is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.